Good afternoon. I'd like to call this meeting to order. My name is Jackie Simmons-Reed, and I'm the chair of the Advisory Committee on Participatory Democracy, and I would like to try to get through this agenda very quickly. We would like to be completed by 2:30. Let's begin with calling the roll. Maggie in Las Vegas, will you take care of that?
It's the white one. Hello. My apologies. Maggie Salas Crispa for the record. I will start with the roll call. Jackie Simmons-Reed.
Here.
Michael Stewart.
Here.
Christopher Dare. He did let us know that he would be jumping on. He had another commitment. Amy Tarkanian.
Here.
Pauline Lee.
Here.
Carlos Padilla.
Here.
Derek Rimson.
Here.
Tammy Tiger.
Here.
Dan Lee.
Here.
Sandra Cosgrove.
Here.
And Douglas Goodman.
Here.
We have quorum, Chair.
Thank you. I want to thank our members for making time to be here today and for making the special effort to try to be here in person. We're going to proceed to the public comment period. I just wanted to make a few brief remarks. I wanted to welcome everyone, members of the public, the press, presenters who are here today. We'll be covering issues related to the upcoming presidential preference primary, and we'll be hearing from the Secretary of State's office about their plans and the upcoming election timelines for 2024. And I also wanted to just very briefly take this opportunity to say a few words about this committee, since I expect that there are people here today who maybe have not tuned in before. The Advisory Committee on Participatory Democracy, or ACPD as it is commonly known, is an advisory group. We are created by the NRS 225 and are under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of State's office. And our mission is to assist the Secretary of State in identifying programs to support public participation and the democratic process, to find ways and support his efforts to encourage civic engagement and to identify solutions to problems that affect the level of participation and access to the voting box. We do not make policy per statute. The work we do here is nonpartisan. We are a group of volunteers consisting of 10 voting members who have been selected by the Secretary of State to represent a cross-section of citizens of this state. Also, too, per our bylaws of this committee, we have the chair and vice chair who served under the previous administration, who the secretary has invited to serve in an emeritus non-voting capacity, and they are here to participate in our meetings. So I want to just again emphasize here that our efforts here, both voting members and emeriti, is to serve at the pleasure of the secretary in support of his efforts for outreach and engagement with the public to increase voter participation in our democratic processes. All right. Before we begin with the public comments, a few housekeeping items to review. We have 2 periods of public comment under our agenda, one at the beginning of the meeting and the other at the end. There are various ways for the public to comment. These include providing public comment in person, either at our meeting location here in Carson City or at the Grant Sawyer State Office Building in Las Vegas. The calling number is area code 888-475-4499. Then you enter the meeting ID code, which is 847-9043-2305, followed by the pound sign. Also, too, there is the option of emailing comments to this committee as well. So I will now ask if we can, and also to note first that this meeting is recorded and available for live and for archiving viewing. So before we begin, I'd also like to thank all the wonderful staff people I see here today and down in Vegas who have helped to make this meeting go smoothly. Your efforts are much appreciated. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and open the first period of public comment. We'll start in person here in Carson City. Is there anyone here in Carson City who wishes to provide public comment at this time? There appears there are not any. So right now, then we'll move on to Las Vegas. So anyone in Las Vegas who wishes to provide any public comment at this time?
Chair, Maggie Salas Crespo for the record. We do not have anybody here for public comment.
All right. Thank you, Maggie. All right. Well, then proceeding to our participants who may have tuned in online via Zoom or otherwise. Is there anyone in the queue for public comment at this time? If so, please, let's move forward and add the first caller in the queue.
Thank you. If you would like to provide public comment at this time, please press star 9 or raise hand in the Zoom client to take your place in the queue. It appears there are no callers wishing to make public comment at this time.
Thank you very much. Well, then we will proceed with our agenda. The first item on our agenda is approval of the minutes for the meeting that we held on April 6th, 2023. Members, you should have received copies of the minutes from this meeting and our later meeting from June 23rd, then via email from Maggie Salas Crespo. Are there any questions regarding the minutes?
Are we on the April minutes or the June minutes?
The April 6th, we'll take the April 6th. If there are no questions, I'd like to call a motion to approve the April
Second.
6th, the April 6th, 2023 minutes.
Yes, second. Did you make a motion? I'd like to make a motion to
Thank you.
approve the April minutes.
Thank you. Pauline Lee made the motion to approve the minutes. Can I have a second?
Second, for the record, is Dan Lee.
Dan Lee, thank you very much. We have a second. Any discussion of the motion? There being no discussion, all in favor, say yes.
Aye.
Yes.
Any opposed? Thank you. The motion passes unanimously. Now we'll just proceed ahead and move on to our the minutes from the our last meeting held on June 23rd, 2023. Are there any questions regarding these minutes?
Yes, this is Pauline Lee. If you look at page 4, the first full paragraph, other appropriations highlighted by Mr. Olashin were, the last sentence that says, in response to a question, is actually Miss Lee. I was the one who asked the question. I think it was. Correct, Dan? I asked that question specifically to ask what the rejection rate was, the signature verification rate. So that's the correction.
Thank you. We will
Both have Lee as the last name, and so that could be a little bit confusing.
Understandably, yes. Thank you for pointing that out. Any other comments? All right. Well, I will go ahead and entertain a motion to approve these minutes as noted with the change offered by Ms. Lee.
I'll make that motion, Madam Chair, to approve the June 23rd minutes with the change as indicated.
Okay. So we have a motion to approve by Vice Chair Mike Stewart. Is there a second?
Second from Pauline Lee.
Thank you. We have a second from Pauline Lee. Any further discussion? All in favor say yes.
Aye.
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 Yes.
Any-
Aye.
Thank you. Any opposed? Thank you. The motion passes. All right, moving ahead. The next item on our agenda for discussion purposes is to receive an overview from Mark Velasquez, our Deputy Secretary of State for Elections, who's going to give us an overview of the presidential preference primary. Thank you, Mark, for being here.
Mark Velasquez for the record. Thank you, Madam Chair, for having me. I apologize for the slight delay in my arrival. We were just finishing up the regulatory review with Legislative Commission upstairs. All of our regulations were passed. Slight side note, not on the agenda. I apologize for that. Speaking to the presidential preference primary that is rapidly approaching, there are a key number of dates I would like to highlight. First and foremost, as we talk about what this presidential preference primary will look like. And then moving to, again, this is purely statutory in nature and those sorts of things. So first and foremost, again, we are now rapidly approaching, as I mentioned, we're about 86 days, I believe it is, almost exactly, from the day that we are required by law to send out mail ballots to our military and overseas citizens. That deadline is not later than Saturday, December 23rd. So in order to meet the deadline of the not later than 45 days prior to the February 6th presidential preference primary, mail ballots will be sent out the week of December 18th to the 23rd. While many people may hear that and think, well, February election is still kind of a long ways away. Early voting doesn't start until January 27th, so maybe no one's really thinking about it. Rest assured, I've had discussions over the last few months, as you can imagine, with our county election officials preparing for and looking to the presidential preference primary. From an overview standpoint, this election is, of course, required by statute. Specifically, it is a primary for the two major parties in order to enable them to assist them in identifying who voters are interested in having as their candidate for the general election. I do want to clarify on this question, it seems to have come up the most, that while February 6th of 2024 is when the presidential preference primary election will be held, with the results and final tabulation and canvasses by the counties no later than 10 days after that, by February 16th, as required by law. The individuals who do receive the most votes in this primary are, again, not required to be the major party candidates for the general election, and we'll speak to that in a moment. So again, it's an election specifically for our two major parties. If there are two or more candidates that file for office for those two major parties. So in other words, again, we're speaking specifically to the Democrats and Republicans. If there are two or more candidates that file during the candidate filing period that begins on Monday for either party, then we will have a presidential preference primary for those major parties. If it's only one major party, if only two individuals file, or two or more rather, for one major party, then there will only be a presidential preference primary for that one major party. I will tell you also that while the candidate filing period begins on Monday and continues through Monday the 16th, we do currently have 5 individuals who have already made appointments with the Office of the Secretary of State for the filing period. I'm not certain. We don't ask party affiliation, so we don't know if there's an even split or if those individuals are all one party or the other. But the bottom line is, again, that this election coming up in February 6th it really hinges on 2 or more candidates for each major party. To do an overview of the timeline, I think sequentially probably makes the most sense, and I apologize for jumping into the mail ballot period a little bit there a minute ago. Very much been on my mind, as you can imagine. Coming up here soon, again on Monday, starting on October 2nd, is the beginning of the candidate filing period. The statute in NRS 298 says that it must go from October 1st to October 15th. Because the 1st and the 15th this year fall on a Sunday, it does shift it to the 2nd to the 16th. So it will be 2 full weeks of candidate filing, followed by a Monday after to ensure that candidates have the appropriate amount of time to file for office as they decide to. Following the candidate filing period, we of course will post on the website of the Office of the Secretary of State the individuals who have filed for office. That information is extremely important when it comes to the administration, really the logistics of an election. By that, as soon as we get the party affiliations and identify, is it going to be 2 major parties? Is it only going to be one? That information must get to the county election officials so that they can continue to work very closely with their vendors to prepare mail ballots. Again, of note, some of those discussions have started as early as July to make sure that counties were ready and that the vendors had the appropriate paper and other information needed to meet the timelines of the election. Following the close of the candidate filing period and pursuant to a regulation that was passed, the ink is still dry on, hasn't even been filed with the office just yet, but just a moment ago, candidates will have, again, there's one of the regulations that was passed clarified that in statute there's an ability for a candidate to withdraw. That period of time is 7 days, excluding Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays. And with the passage of the regulation moments earlier, at the close of candidate filing on the 16th, there is the possibility for a candidate of the PPP, the Presidential Preference Primary, to withdraw for 7 days, again, not including Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays. And then a subsequent regulation or provision in the same regulation allows for a challenge period as well of 5 calendar days. I do want to be perfectly clear that when we talk about the candidate filing period, when we talk about the candidate withdrawal period, and when we talk about the candidate challenge period, that we are speaking specifically to the presidential preference primary and not the November general election. We've already begun to receive questions about that process. And if a candidate withdraws from the presidential preference primary, does that somehow invalidate them from the November general election? And that is a key point that I would like to stress, that the presidential preference primary, again, required by statute, does not force any private organization to select their candidate for the general election, does not tip their hand or otherwise kind of corner them into doing so. Our elections, of course, the very root of them is to identify the will of the people. These elections will identify the people's preference based on the candidates on their appropriate ballot. And then, again, it allows the private organizations to go through their processes over the coming months to then notify the Secretary of State prior to the general election of who their candidate will ultimately be. I think it's also important to clarify that While there may be, or while there is going to be, for example, a caucus process, again, they are separate, and I believe we will be speaking to those later. As the agency has continued to receive questions, and this has happened, frankly, in every presidential year, going back as far as I've heard and talked to my predecessors. When there are caucuses, the Office of the Secretary of State receives questions about where they are, how they work. We then, and will continue to direct those questions to the political parties so that they can provide that information in a clear and timely manner. And that way we aren't regurgitating information or possibly misinforming a voter about that very important process either. Because the passage of Assembly Bill 126 in the 2021 legislative session requires and ultimately was codified and created the existence of the presidential preference primary, that means that this election will be conducted almost exactly, as every other election that we have in the state. The important difference, I think, that I want to highlight is that while our primary election in June and our November election have 2 weeks of early voting, the presidential preference primary has 1 week under statute. But otherwise, I mentioned previously that the effective absentee system for elections will be employed. Years ago, that was a tool specifically designed for and only turned on for federal elections. It ties into the Uniformed and Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act, covered voters, military, their dependents, and overseas citizens. But because of the passage of Assembly Bill 121, also during the 2021 legislative session, that same tool, EASE, is now considered an accessibility tool. So it now gets turned on for every election. And I mention that simply to say that because the presidential preference primary is a federal primary, the requirement to send out mail ballots to our uniformed and overseas citizens no later than the 45th day prior to the election, that is in effect. And because we are required to send out mail ballots no later than the 45th day before the election, which is December 23rd, we will also ensure that the EASE system is turned on and activated no later than the 45th day prior to the election as well. Again, in practice, what does that mean? At the county levels, mail ballots will be hitting the mail stream between the 18th and the 23rd is the no later than date. That Saturday, the 18th of December is the Monday. So mail ballots will begin to go out to our military overseas citizens. And then our EASE tool, which again, it can be used by covered voters, the covered voters being military, active duty military overseas citizens, their dependents, as well as voters with a disability and tribal voters who live on a colony or reservation as well. And that will again be turned on and will remain on through the close of polls on election day. That process, without getting into the nuance too much, again, it provides a timestamp so that truly a covered voter can register and cast their ballot up to the close of polls, whether it's 7 p.m., 6:59 and 59 seconds exactly, or if directed by a court. If it does extend, that would apply to the same system as well. So mail ballots will go out. Our EASE system will be turned on. We move into January, and I won't get into the public notification piece. I'll talk about that a little bit separately here as well. January 27th is the start of early voting. Early voting, again, this has been a topic of great discussion across our counties already. Even just yesterday, I was talking with a few individuals about the timelines for early voting at different locations. Again, you will find that our county election officials are matched in their passion for enabling voters to vote with Secretary Aguilar and the Elections Division. It's something that we all take very seriously, and they've been looking at past elections and trying to identify best practices to apply and make sure that voters can vote by the method of their choosing through Election Day on February 6th. 1 week of early voting, again, and then the polls will be open from 7 to 7 a.m. to p.m., of course, on Election Day on February 6th. To back up a little bit and to provide a bit of information in regards to the voter education and awareness piece. That is something that we've identified really over the last few years, continues to be a challenge, and is something that Secretary Aguilar, our public information officer, really the entire staff at the elections division, as well as our clerks and registrars have spent a lot of time thinking about and looking very closely at. The legislature appropriated $877,000 through the passage of Senate Bill 484 this last legislative session, specifically for voter education and outreach. I will tell you, education and outreach is not cheap, and that those funds, while certainly lofty, when you think about every one of those being a tax dollar and worthy of the utmost respect and conservation, it would go very quickly when we have what amounts to 15 months of education to provide. When you think about the very first action of maybe the very first formal action of the election cycle being the start of candidate filing on October 2nd, though I would argue, again, our clerks and registrars have been already working for months to prepare their training and other the machines and otherwise. When you look to the kind of the finish line, essentially it's January of 2025. That's a very large period of time with a lot of nuance between the president's preference primary, the June primary, and the November election, that we need to use those funds to make sure that we're informing voters of their rights and opportunities to cast ballots in a safe and secure manner. To that end, though, again, it's something that our county election officials have been talking closely about, how to inform the counties about, in the electorate specifically, about what a presidential preference primary is, what the timelines are, who it applies to, because another important statute to be mindful of is the passage of same-day voter registration. So while this presidential preference primary is focused specifically on the two major political parties, the fact of the matter is that a voter up to the close of polls who is not affiliated with one of those two major parties does have the ability to update their voter registration, change their political affiliation to one of those two major parties, and then cast a ballot in that election as well. In that regards, it's oftentimes similar to the June primary, but I suspect we'll discuss that election at a future meeting. So in general, again, the election, or more specifically rather, early voting 27th, election day the 6th, the requirements across Title 24 otherwise remain the same. Mail ballots must be delivered in person to the county through a mail drop box or otherwise postmarked no later than the close of polls. There will be 4 days to have that mail ballot returned to the county election officials, with an additional 2 days after for signature curing, that the process by which a county election official will look closely at the signature outside of the mail ballot envelope, compare it to the voter registration. If there's any question or concern about the validity of that signature matching what's in the voter registration, the county election officials have ultimately 6 days after election day to conduct that curing process. That, by the way, and while we're talking about it, is also a major focus of our outreach effort. Only about 62% of Nevada voters have a phone number on their voter registration. And that's concerning specifically because if a voter only has their residential address as part of their voter registration, and that county election official has a question on their signature, the only way that they can get in touch with that voter is through mail. And that can, oftentimes, if they're not checking their mail fairly closely, they may not find out that their signature was called into question until after the deadline is passed. So we certainly encourage voters to update voter registrations and to incorporate an email address, ideally, as well as a phone number, recognizing, again, email is kept secure and private in most cases. Excuse me. So other than the 6 days for curing process, we must finish tabulation of the ballots no later than the 7th day following the election, and that allows the county commissions to canvass the vote no later than the 10th day after the election. Now, what's a little unique about the presidential preference primary as well is that similar to our June primary, there is no Supreme Court canvass, of course, at the end of it. The final action that will occur is actually a letter from Secretary Aguilar to the major parties identifying who has received the most votes cast. Again, that letter, there's no you shall, there's no mandate. This is simply to notify and inform the party leadership of the number of votes cast by the Nevada electorate in this specific election. And then at that point, as you can imagine, we will pivot and focus on preparing for the June primary that is also rapidly approaching. But that, I believe, is a decent overview. Hopefully I didn't get into the weeds too much. But that being said, I am available for your questions if you have any.
Thank you, Mark. That's very helpful. Are there any questions from members of the committee?
Madam Chair, thank you. For the record, Doug Goodman, Vice Chair Emeritus. This is more of a comment than a question. Because we have a February primary, that my concern is that come June, there will be voters who think they've already voted in a primary and not pay attention to the June primary. So my hope is that the parties, the candidates, Secretary of State's office, special interest groups, become active to make sure voters understand that the primary in June is a separate election, is for state and local offices, and that what they voted in was just for presidential preference. So I just wanted to bring that up, and just hopefully that will not be a problem. But my fear is if enough people have that mindset, that we could see a record low turnout in June, which would not be good. Thank you.
Excellent point, Mr. Goodman. Mark Voloshin for the record. And you're right in identifying that as a concern. Because ultimately, right, we don't want any one voter to assume that they voted in the primary in February and then maybe miss or not pay attention to the June primary, or even to experience the frustrations in February of receiving a mail ballot, looking at the list of voters and saying, I feel like there should be more races on this one than just these. So that is also something that we've been looking very closely at. We have some ideas about our outreach effort that integrate very directly into that as a means to stress that there are 3 elections coming up in 2024 in February, June, and November. They're distinct, and while by the time we get to the November election, another concern, I think kind of similarly, is that for voters who do vote in February, then vote in June, having almost a voter exhaustion experience, and by November, perhaps not being interested in voting because they feel like they've already voted enough. So these are concerns that we are aware of, and again, looking at ways to educate, inform, and prepare voters for the experience of receiving 3 mail ballots, and even add a layer on that. There may even possibly be special elections between now and November, so there may be more opportunities for voters to receive a mail ballot as required by our laws, and to cast it, and to make sure that voters in general are aware of the process, why things are happening the way they are, and again, the importance of being involved in casting their vote in these important civic duties.
Dan, sorry. Should
I do have a question for Mr. Olashin. Do you anticipate that the county clerks will keep their workers on for a long time, or will they be bringing on temporary workers for each of those elections?
Thank you for the question, Ms. Lee. Mark Voloshin for the record. I suspect it will be a combination of both. There's a requirement, an essential requirement for temporary workers to conduct any election. It could not be done alone with the permanent staff that any county has, period. I think that the counties, again, based purely on some of the conversations I've had over the last few weeks, are attuned to that and working very closely with other county leadership to maximize their recruiting efforts. And I know they're trying to create an environment where individuals maybe want to sign up for all 3 elections. Certainly the more engaged a poll worker is, the ultimately better off the county staff will feel supported. They'll be familiarized with the processes, and it will make it run a little bit more smoothly. But that being said, also, again, a February election, a June election, November, there's drastic differences even in the timing. By the time June 11th comes up, it's my understanding, last I saw, that the high schools, for example, will be out. So high school seniors, again, we have a statute that allows for individuals who of a certain age to be a poll worker. They will obviously be in school in both February and November, potentially. So I do know that, to answer directly, it'll be a combination of permanent staff and temporary workers. And I do know that I will suspect that not one of our county election officials will call me and say, hey, Mark, just so you know, we're good. We got enough people. We don't need anybody else. If anybody's asking, tell them not to call us. I'm certain I will not hear those words again over the next 15 months.
Madam Chair, this is Cisco Aguilar. I just have a response to staffing. We are trying to work to figure out how to get lawyers the opportunity to work polls and receive CLE credit. I think engaging the legal community would be extremely beneficial from many perspectives, but also, too, having somebody who understands the law on a polling site could be a benefit to their fellow poll workers, but also, too, being an ambassador in the legal community for how elections work and that they are secure and safe. So those are some of the creative things we're trying to do to ensure that we do have the workforce to manage our elections.
I have a quick question, Dan Lee, for the record. So I asked a sort of similar question before. Is there any voter education being done as far as, educating them that this is like a closed primary in terms of maybe they need to update their voter registration, or like how much is that going to be the state versus the counties versus the political parties being responsible for that? So they can get the mail ballots sent to them.
Excellent question, Mr. Lee. Mark Voloshin for the record. I can't speak for the parties, advocate groups, or others, but I will say that is an important part of the messaging as well. When it comes to expectation management, we want voters to know to expect a ballot or to not expect a ballot. We want them to know that if they do change their party affiliation to a major party before the 14th day, then they will still receive that mail ballot as well. I'm hopeful that that's an important message that's being shared in addition to February 6th, January 27th, December 23rd, these other sort of deadlines, because I think you're absolutely right in ensuring that if voters know how to take part in the process, or at the very least, if they're registered with a minor party or a no party affiliate, that they are not going to be able to receive a mail ballot. I think those expectations are equally important across the board. So that is an excellent point that you raise.
Madam Chairman, Pauline Lee, I did have one question. You stated that you had 5 candidates who had appointments with the Secretary of State's office. Does an appointment constitute an intent to file? In other words, an appointment doesn't mean necessarily that they intend to file, correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Lee. Mark Voloshin for the record. I apologize, I should have clarified. Those 5 have appointments in our candidate filing appointment system. We established, in order to streamline the process and enable candidates to be able to plan their days a little bit more effectively, in the last few years, we instituted an online appointment system. It's actually the same system that we use for our commercial recordings side for individuals who are making appointments there. Blocks of time, so that way an individual can identify, well, I'm going to be in Las Vegas or Carson City, in what blocks of time. So I apologize for the confusion, but yes, 5 individuals have made appointments through the Secretary of State's candidate filing appointment system.
Thank you for that clarification. I have just one brief question, and I think we have to move on because we are under some time constraint to try to conclude our business today by 2:30. In connection with the candidate filings, you mentioned that you will, after that period has closed, will post the names. Do you have a specific timeline for that, where we'll know then whether you're holding a PPP for one party or 2?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. Mark Voloshin for the record. Yes, and in fact, this is a system that we have discussed. It may be earlier than that you're able to determine if we are going to be having 1 or 2 or none. The The process, as we've worked closely with the Secretary and our Public Information Officer, is at the conclusion of each day, we are going to update. There's a document, in fact, if you look on nvsos.gov right now, under our 2024 election information page, about halfway down the page, there's a link that if you click will take you to the currently blank template that will list the candidates who file, and we will update that on a daily basis. As I recall, I think 3 individuals have their appointments on October 2nd, with the other 2 later on. So there is a very good chance at least one party may have identified that they will have, through their candidates, of course, a requirement for a PPP. But we will update that daily through the 16th, and then by the end of the day on the 16th, we will post and make sure that we note that that is the final list, pending withdrawals and, of course, challenges.
Michael Stewart, for the record. Thank you, Mr. Volashin, for your presentation. It's very informative. I want to go back to AB 126 just really quickly. You mentioned a few times about the non-binding nature of the presidential preference primary, and I'm wondering, other states that might have presidential preference primaries, are there other states that have that sort of non-binding language, or or is it sort of set up a little bit differently? And if you don't have that answer now, feel free to bring it back to the committee. I'd be just curious on what other states have with regard to that.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart, for the question. Mark Volashin, of the record. I appreciate both the question and the opportunity to come back with a better answer. I do know at least one other state that had binding language that had to remove it ultimately. Another one, I believe, had non-binding language and had to remove it also. But I will get you a more effective and thought-out answer than that.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation. Very informative. Let's move ahead to agenda item in this section. Earlier this month, the Secretary of State extended an invitation to the members of the 2 major parties who are the subject of the presidential preference primary, and invited them to send a representative here to this meeting to address the committee about their respective plans with respect to voter education around the presidential preference primary. And before we actually get into those specific presentations, I'd like to recognize Maggie Salas-Crispo, our Deputy Secretary for the Southern Nevada. She has a statement to read, which will help us understand some of the ground rules that need to apply to this presentation, these 2 presentations. Maggie, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chair Maggie Salas-Crespo. For the record, I will read the statement here that has been approved by our legal representation. The Secretary of State's office is pleased that representatives from each major party could be here to present this to this committee. The request for these presentations was that they focus on efforts by the major parties to educate voters on the upcoming presidential preference primary, since this is the first election in many years that will only be open to members of major parties. However, there is ongoing litigation between the Secretary of State's office and one of the parties on this specific issue. Council has advised us in this committee, which is under the authority of the Secretary of State, to focus any questions directed to major parties to points of clarification and understanding, which could exclude questions, sharing opinions, or weighing the merits of proposed policies. The committee is free to discuss these presentations amongst themselves during the meeting after the presentations are conducted. We thank you for your understanding. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Maggie. Are there any questions regarding Maggie's, the statement that Maggie read? Okay, let's move ahead, and I believe the first presenter is going to be presenting via Zoom. Ms. Barnett, who represents the Democratic Party of Nevada.
Yes, hi, thank you, Chair.
Welcome, thank you for being here.
Thank you as well. I had submitted a PowerPoint. I wasn't sure if I should share my screen or if there's a separate process for that.
I think it would be helpful with people participating virtually if we could do a screen sharing as well.
Awesome. Okay. Let me just. All right. I don't think I have the capability to share. It's not allowed. It doesn't have that option.
Chair, we do have Maria with the Secretary of State's office in Carson City who has the presentations and can put it in the computer. This is Maggie
I'm
Salas
happy
Crespo for the record.
Okay. One moment, please.
No problem.
Okay. So Maria, can you just advance these slides as Ms. Barnett speaks to our group? Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. All right, my name is Hillary Barrett, and I am the Executive Director for the Nevada Democratic Party, and I'd like to thank you for the invitation to participate in today's meeting and go over our plans for our own delegate selection process, but as well as, our communication plans for educating Democrats and voters across Nevada about the upcoming presidential preference primary that we're very excited to have. So I think next slide, I was just going to do a very brief overview of our own delegate selection process, followed by more detailed information about our communication plans to both, registered Democrats and any voters that we're wanting to help turn out for the February primary. So next slide, I'm just going to very quickly go over our own process. Nevada Democrats will use the results of a state-run presidential primary on February 6th, 2024 to determine the allocation of delegates to our state convention and then additionally to our national convention. And our national convention delegates will be elected at our state convention. Delegates to the state convention will be elected at assembly district delegate election meetings held on April 13th. And the total number of delegates from each assembly district is weighted on a Democratic performance formula. And the allocation of delegates is determined by the results of that presidential primary and locked in place at every step of the process. Next slide, just for context, Nevada has allocated 48 delegates to the Democratic National Convention with 3 alternates, the bulk of those being district level delegates that will be elected all at our state convention. We have a 3-step process with our next, if you could go to the next slide. In order to participate and become a national delegate, you have to have participated in the presidential primary either by in-person, early vote, or via mail, and we're really excited to have all of those options as more accessible ways for folks to participate. You then have to go to your delegate election meetings on April 13th and the state convention in May. Our delegate requirements are pretty simple. You have to be a registered Democrat, have voted in the presidential preference primary on election day or during the early vote period, et cetera, and then attend all of the next steps. We also have specific representation goals. This is intended, on our next slide, this is intended to ensure that our delegation is reflective of the state of Nevada being a majority minority state with and reflective of all of the diverse and vibrant communities we have across Nevada. All right, so now I'm going to move on to our voter engagement and communication plans. So first slide, in order for NV Dems to hold a successful delegate election process next year, we know that starts with ensuring we work to turn out as many Democrats as possible to participate in our state's first presidential preference primary. NV Dems will work tirelessly to bring attention to the 2024 presidential primary by communicating to Democrats across the state with an emphasis on diverse communities, including rural and urban populations. So next slide, the type of communications that we will be engaging in include paid communication via digital and print advertisement, earned communication via our press and communications team, utilizing our websites like iwillvote.com, which is a national website hosting lots of voting information for every state, the DNC's own websites, and then of course our own NVDEM's website. We'll be creating lots of digital content and training, and we'll also be doing traditional in-person organizing. Next slide, I'll go into a little more detail about our paid communications plans. The NVDEMs have allocated a paid communication budget to ensure voters have an understanding of how to participate in the presidential preference primary. So we'll be taking out paid advertising and publications. We have our own rules that stipulate that we must do so at least at one publication in every county. So we'll be doing that across the state in the months of December, January leading up to the primary. We'll also be investing in geo-targeted digital ads focused on democratically dense areas and communities of color to encourage participation in the primary. Our next slide goes a little over our earned communications. So that is the NVDEMs have already invested in communications and digital staff who will work to ensure we're consistently relaying how to participate in the primary. And so that work will include hosting regular press conferences, particularly in January of 2024, placing regular op-eds and LTEs, letters to the editor, from both in-state and national validators on the benefits of switching from a caucus to a primary and on the importance of participating, and then consistent messaging aimed at voter education. Our next slide just goes a little bit over online information. So key information surrounding all aspects of the PPP and our own delegate selection process is already housed under the delegate selection process page on nvdems.com. Information on our website will be regularly updated and expanded on, and will also be available in both English and Spanish starting in December. And so we will seek to be translating all of our any materials we make around the presidential primary, and the DSP will be translated into Spanish. We will also partner with the DNC and iwillvote.com to ensure that there's easy and accessible information and accurate information on their websites as well. Next slide is a little bit about our digital content. We know that in today's environment, particularly post-COVID, that the best way to reach voters is online. So we have already invested in full-time digital staff that will oversee creating consistent, accurate, and unique content across all of our social platforms, relaying information about the presidential preference primary. That content will include ways to vote, key dates, training materials, how to get registered, delegate selection information, etc. And we are active on all major platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Our main mediums will include posts, graphics, GIFs, videos, and easily digestible training materials, again, in both English and Spanish. On to the next slide, which is just to sort of wrap all of this up. While all of those types of kind of paid and earned communication is a great way to reach voters, we know that it's vital that we also know that we need to invest in doing what NVDEMS does best, which is grassroots organizing, in order for our presidential preference primary to have good turnout and for our own delegate selection process to go well. So NVDEMS will be investing in organizing staff with an early focus on voter education, recruitment, and turnout for our PPP, DEM meetings, state convention, etc. Particular focuses will include outreach programs in diverse communities. And then lastly, this is just a little bit about our own internal sort of organization and structure. On to the next slide. The Read Machine's sustained success in Nevada is due in large part to the vibrancy and activism of our engaged affiliate groups that include over 50 county parties, caucuses, and clubs across the Silver State. These entities are ingrained in their communities and constituencies throughout and through NVDEM's organizing and training programs will be recruited to be precinct leaders and DEM delegate election meeting chairs, become DSP and PPP experts, go through train the trainer programs, and be empowered to lead their own voter outreach and education across their regions. So those are our plans for the upcoming presidential primary that we're just really, really excited about. The Democratic Party is very supportive of this switch from caucus to primary. It makes it a lot more accessible for people to make their voice heard, and we're just really excited. So I don't know if I'm supposed to take questions, but I'm happy to answer any questions or follow up with any other information, but really appreciate the invitation to speak to everybody today, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Barnett. I'd like to ask the committee, mindful of the statement that Maggie made, if anyone has any questions regarding just the substantive statements, material that has just been shared by Ms. Barnett. Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much for making the time to be with us today. And let's proceed ahead with our second presenter. This is going very smoothly. We have Jim DeGraffenreich from the Republican, the National Republican Committee. You're the National Committeeman. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair and Committee. And we also appreciate the opportunity to be here and present our plans and ideas to you. I believe I see our presentation also loaded
Yes.
on the computer as well. So I'm going to go ahead and fire that up. All right, so again, for the record, Jim DeGraffenreid, I'm the National Committee Man for Nevada for the Republican Party, here to tell you a little bit today about our process and how we will be binding delegates and using the caucus to allocate those as well. Computer works a little differently than mine does. All right, so a little quick overview. I only have 8 slides, so hopefully we'll get some time back into your agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about what is the caucus, the history behind it, how the presidential preference poll will work for us, what our caucus mechanics are, and then cover also our voter outreach plan and how we intend to get people to know that this is happening and what we're going to do. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what is a caucus, because this is a bipartisan committee and we know that many people may not have participated in a Republican caucus before. At its very simplest, a caucus is a gathering of neighbors and friends by precinct who get together to discuss politics and the party platform, and also to elect delegates to the county convention. And then the county convention in turn will elect delegates to the state convention, and the state convention will elect delegates to the national convention. In our case, the caucus happens as a part of that. It happens at the end of our precinct meetings where we do all of that delegate selection work. And so that at the end of the meeting, anybody present will then be able to cast their votes in the Nevada presidential preference poll. We do have a drop and go feature as part of our caucus that does not require somebody to stay for the entire meeting if all they want to do is cast their vote in the presidential preference poll. They are able to arrive at any time to the precinct meeting, sign in, obtain a ballot, cast their vote, and go if they have no interest in participating in county convention, state convention, or going on forward from there. Obviously, we hope that people will do so. A little quick bit of presidential nominating history in Nevada. From 1864 to 1948, presidential electors were directly elected by the people. There was one exception. The Democrats did find a provision in law in 1911 that they used to hold a primary election for the 1912 presidential election. Then in 1949, legislation was passed that had each party select their electors at their state convention, and this continues for both parties to this day. In 1953, a law was passed to have a primary in place of caucuses for binding of delegates, but that was actually repealed in 1955. It never even made it to the 1956 election. In 1973, a primary law was passed again, and both parties did use the presidential primary in place of caucuses in the 1976 and 1980 presidential elections. But that 1981 primary law was repealed again. There was dissatisfaction with high cost and low turnout, and so the legislature did away with that law following the 1980 presidential primary. So from 1984 until now, with a few exceptions, closed caucuses have been used to bind party delegates. First exception was the 1996 GOP mail primary. The legislature allowed each party to make a choice, and in that year the Democrats chose to stay with the caucus. The Republican Party decided they would go ahead and try the mail primary. That particular law expired by statute after the one time, and so then we have been back to it since then. There have been a couple of exceptions when we have had incumbent Republican presidents without serious challengers. George W. Bush, 2004, Donald Trump, 2020. We simply bound all of our delegates by party rule to the incumbent president. We have had a significant increase in caucus since the initial First in the West caucus in 2008. We peaked at just over 75,000 voters in 2016. That was 17.8% of registered Republicans, which compares very favorably with the June 2016 primary overall turnout of 18.2%. It was 2008 is a very important year because that was when the First in the West became the thing in Nevada for both Democrats and Republicans. Prior to that, Nevada did not make their voice heard either by caucus or primary until well after other states had already determined for us who that candidate would be. So we have seen a significant increase, as I know the Democrat Party has as well, in interest in the caucus and primary process since 2008. In 2024, we're going to continue our longstanding tradition of holding a caucus, and it will be the only binding method for delegate allocation. We will bind all of our delegates based on the caucus. Our filing deadline matches the state's deadline. It will end on October 16th. It was originally set for the 15th, but again, because that's a Sunday, we are extended to the 16th. The caucus itself will be held on February 8th, 2024. It will have a 5 p.m. uniform start time for all 17 counties. The way we bind our delegates is proportional. We get 23 delegates and 23 alternates that we elect. There is no minimum threshold, and we are a proportional state, which means that every candidate in the caucus has an opportunity to win delegates. It is not a winner-take-all where the person who has the most votes takes every delegate. We do require that somebody get enough votes to win at least one delegate, and that's about 4.5% when we have 23 delegates available to us. We have multiple candidates who have either already filed or have committed to file during the filing period. The caucus will determine again the binding of our national delegates on the first ballot, and then the National Convention will determine the nominee, much as is done with the Democrat Party, and then both major parties will report back to the Secretary of State who the nominee is for the November ballot as determined by our National Convention. Our caucus goals are to increase voter registration and participation. The caucus is good for this because the candidates actually participate in that process. Candidates, as you can see from the process, have a vested interest in making sure that people turn out to the caucus, making sure that they are participants in their party, that they go to the convention, and that they will then support those candidates through the county and state conventions. And so they do a very good job of sending supporters to join central committees and conventions. So the caucus is a large party building tool, one of the reasons that we wanted to continue it. It also builds energy and excitement for the 2024 elections because these volunteers that are brought in by the caucus process then become part of our field operation going forward into the 2024 election. It does allow voters to engage in meaningful dialogue with other voters in their precinct, although again, that is an optional thing. If somebody wants to simply vote and go, they can. We include important and popular safeguards in the electoral process. We do use voter ID in the caucus, which over 70% of voters do approve of, regardless of what party they are in. We do precinct-based voting rather than central voting centers so that people are able to vote in their own neighborhoods. And we do timely and transparent counting and tabulation of ballots. We understand and intend to fully follow every statute and regulation and action that we're authorized to take in the June primary and the general election, but we do feel that with the caucus, we want to have the safeguards that are listed here on this slide in place. This slide simply walks through the caucus process. We have our February 8th, 2024 precinct meetings. Voters can either participate fully, as you see in the green box, or they can drop and go, as in the blue box. Delegate speeches are given right before by supporters of each candidate in the caucus, and then the results are tabulated by precinct, reported to the counties, and then the counties report those to the state party. Our convention will be in March. May 3rd and 4th will be our state convention. That will be where we elect our national delegates. And then the Republican National Convention will be July 15th in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Our voter outreach methods, similar to the Democrat Party, we have rules that are actually left over from when this was in statute. We are required to place in every 17 counties throughout the state a newspaper listing of all of the dates of the caucus. We are already getting earned media. We're looking into also doing public service announcements. We will do text to Republican voters in their precincts. We use texting to our voters to great effect in voter turnout in the regular election. We will do that for this election as well. Information will be published on state and county party websites. We will do email alerts, and then we have our field organization is underway as well, so that we will be making calls and working in the precincts door to door to turn people out for the caucus as well. Our precinct locations will be published no later than November 30th. We already have Commit to Caucus website is live at nevadagop.org, so as we're reaching out to voters, they have a place to go and let us know that they do intend to caucus. We also drive them to update voter registration through the registertovotemv.com website, letting them know, of course, that you have to be registered in a party in order to participate. All of the voting will take place in person on February 8th, 2024, as mentioned. That is the end of our presentation. We will also be happy to take questions if anybody on the committee has any.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Gravenreid. For the record, Doug Goodman, Vice Chair Emeritus. I'd like just a little clarification on your drop and go. We know a very important part of the caucus of actually attending is that if your candidate should not meet the minimum, as you're using, you get to say, okay, I'm going to go over here and I'll caucus with this candidate and vote for that. On your drop and go ballot, will Republicans have the opportunity to express that if their first choice, if their choice candidate does not meet the minimum, that their vote can be reassigned to another candidate? Or is it just the one vote, and if their candidate doesn't meet minimum?
It is, thank you for the question, it is just the one vote. Our ballot is a simple paper ballot, much as you would have in any other election, where all of the candidates who are filed are listed. And then we do not do any ranked choice where we move on to subsequent rounds of voting and move people from group to group. So voters that vote at the end of the meeting will be presented with the same ballot as somebody who drops and goes, and then that one candidate will get that vote, and that'll be counted.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. Appreciate it.
Are there any questions? Clarifying questions, I should say. I'll just briefly ask one, sir, and it relates to your last slide about the voter registration. You were here for Mark Velasquez's presentation that discussed the same day, the opportunity for voters to change their registration or to amend it
Right.
same day. How does that work within your caucus?
The caucus does not offer same-day voter registration, and so we will be working in advance of the caucus to get people to re-register into a party so that they can participate. But the Republican Party will not have same-day voter registration at the caucus.
Do you have a specific deadline?
The deadline in the rules is 30 days prior to caucus.
Thank you. Any other questions?
One quick question. So on the outreach methods, just I'm curious, and I think I can ask this, is just with the existence of the presidential preference primary, and how is that going to mesh with your outreach efforts to make sure people can also get to your the caucus process as well?
Based on Mr. Wolashin's presentation, it sounds like they're going to mesh very well, because we will be reaching out to our voters with much the same message that they are, and we're very appreciative of the fact that the Secretary of State's office is going to refer questions on the caucus back to the parties so that we're able to answer. But our goal, I think, is the same between the Secretary of State's office and ours. We want to maximize participation and make sure that people are aware of what's going on. And so it sounds like we'll be following a very similar track.
Okay. Any further questions from our members down in Las Vegas? All right. There being none, let's proceed. Thank you very much
Madam
for your
Chair, this is
presentation.
Madam
Oh,
Madam
did you
Chair,
have?
this is Cisco Aguilar.
Yes.
I just wanted to thank everybody for coming today to present and educate us on what this looks like in the presidential primary, preferential primary with the Democrats and the caucus with the Republicans. I found it very informative and appreciate their time. So thank you.
Agreed. Thank you very much. All right, our next item on the agenda is just a general election timeline update. And we have Mark here to do that. Thank you.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. Mark Voloshin, Deputy Secretary of State for Elections for the record. For a remainder of the 2024 election timeline update, it would be almost too easy and frankly a little bit of a disservice if I merely mentioned, oh, by the way, there's a June 11 election. Oh, by the way, here there's a November 5th general election coming up. I think it's a disservice in part because it doesn't inform voters fully to the realities of the election process or truly the incredible work that is conducted at the county level and in support of, or supported by the state level as well, of course, of the elections division, by their county election officials and the hardworking staff members they have. So if I may, I will be as brief as I can, recognizing the time that we have, but I do want to flesh out and take this opportunity to shed some light, frankly, on the realities of the next 15 months, which, if you focus on June 11th and November 5th, it doesn't sound that bad, and maybe there's plenty of opportunity for other things. We've talked at length about the presidential preference primary. I will not rehash that. Outside of saying that while that preparations are already ongoing, preparing machines, training election officials, recruiting temporary workers, as we get into the new year, there are other things that will be conducted concurrently, and you will find that this is the case across the elections that will be going on next year. So I'll move through it chronologically, just so that everyone's on the same page, and I will apologize in advance to the county election officials in the room with me, as well as those watching from home. Hopefully this does not induce indigestion for them nearly as much as it does for me. So to start with, the new year, while many folks will be recovering from their various merriments, election officials will be focused intently on the judicial filing period that will begin on January 2nd. The judicial filing period goes from January 2nd to January 12th of 2024. Again, and that's going to continue through the period of time where training will be conducted, outreach will be conducted. Those sorts of activities at the county and state level are ongoing throughout the next calendar year. Following, again, the judicial filing period, concluding on January 12th, of course, I mentioned previously that early voting begins on January 27th, so just a few weeks later, before moving into the February 6th election. Talked a little bit about the requirements by statute to accept mail ballots, process them, tabulate, provide documents to the county commissioners so that they can canvass the vote no later than the 10th day after. That gets us through February 16th. It's been an exhausting year, and we're only 2 months in. Following the February 16th timeline, again, no rest for the weary, because the non-judicial filing period begins on March 4th. To illustrate what exactly that means, in 2022, we had a little over 1,200 candidates that filed for office during judicial and non-judicial filing periods. So from the city filing offices to the county filing offices and at the Secretary of State's office for those individuals who will be filing as appropriate, they will come in during that 2-week period to file for office in preparation for the upcoming primary or general as applicable. That's March 4th through March 15th of 2024. April 27th is the no later than date to turn on our effective system for absentee elections, EASE, that UACAVA system I mentioned earlier. So the preparations will begin immediately following the non-judicial filing period. And again, at that point, more recruitment of temporary workers. Any issues that were addressed, maybe in some cases polling locations might cancel contracts if there's too much controversy. So we may require some activities at the county and city levels to find new locations. That will continue up to April 27th when EASE will be turned on, the UACAVA deadline for mail ballots to go out to our overseas citizens. Following that, early voting will begin on May 25th. May 25th is when early voting starts for our June primary, which goes through June 7th in preparation for our June 11th primary election. Again, 10 days, similar to the previous election as referred. The commissioners must canvass no later than June 21st. So again, lots of paperwork, and then everyone's done and we all go on vacation, but not quite. Concurrent with our election cycle, of course, there's the initiative and referendum process identified in our Constitution. There are certain initiatives and referendum that if they are submitted with the appropriate number of signatures, the raw count must be identified, and that the due date for those initiatives is no later than 15 days after the June primary. So in many cases, those organizations that are gathering signatures will continue to do that up through the June 11th primary, and then they have the 15 days after to try to finish gathering signatures before ultimately submitting those petitions. If it's a statewide initiative, right, we're talking potentially hundreds of thousands of signatures by county that have to be assessed to make sure they meet the raw count, and then again validated later through a process to ensure the verification of signatures as well. That process, again, mandated by our state constitution and in statute, continues through the months of June and July. Following that, the next kind of big ticket item is that federal law actually prohibits standardized list maintenance activities at the county level 90 days leading up to an election with a federal candidate. So because we have 3 elections with federal candidates, that 90-day blackout period, as it's referred to in NVRA, the National Voter Registration Act, means that following our June primary, there's going to be a significant amount of work required at the county level to receive the mail ballots that were in many cases, or sample ballots or otherwise, that were identified as being undeliverable, and then turn around and follow some procedures to notify the voters so that they can then be potentially inactivated before our general election. Again, it's an extremely tight timeline on that one as well, before hitting the 90-day mark prior to the November election. So we're still in July, talked about initiatives and referendum, moving into list maintenance, and then again, Saturday, September 21st is the 45th day prior to the November 5th election. That's when our ease system will be turned on again. So again, the preparatory work there as well. Early voting begins October 19th and runs through November 1st before our November 5th general election. And then everything's done and we get, no, wait, hold on, there's more here. Oh my gosh, it keeps going. Right, because of course then it's not just November 5th, it's November 15th for the canvass, but then also November 26th for the Supreme Court canvass, just before the holiday. But then even beyond that, because it's a presidential election, there's a requirement for us to meet with the Electoral College. That will occur on December 17th. And then again, there's paperwork required from that process that must be submitted to a number of individuals, and that's again after the December 17th meeting, but prior to the January 6th, 2025 meeting of Congress, and then ultimately the January 20th inauguration, I believe it is, in 2025. So all that being said, again, significant amounts of work that our county and city and state election officials are keenly aware of, have been keeping a very close eye on, have had numerous discussions over the previous months, and in many cases since they were elected in November. This is an election that, again, from the secretary on down through to our newest staff member at any county and state, we are paying very close attention to, with an utmost determination to ensure that Nevadans can cast their ballots and have confidence that their votes are cast and counted properly, pursuant to Nevada law and federal law. So a lot on our plate in the months ahead. I will simply finalize this presentation by stating that the 2024 election page on the Secretary of State's website will have an updated elections calendar for individuals that would like to see and kind of have it laid out on the Excel spreadsheet, the dates that I just referred to, along with the many, many other dates. Dates for 60 days prior to an election for a voter to be able to opt out of receiving a mail ballot, and many others. Those other dates are all captured on a calendar that we provide to the county and city clerks and make public as well, because we want people to know that elections administration is no small thing. It requires attention to detail, it requires dedication. Excuse me. And your county, city, and state election officials under Secretary Aguilar's leadership are determined to make sure that this next election is the best Nevada election ever, as we try to in every election cycle. That being said, do you have any questions for me?
Any questions for Mark? Sure.
Thank you, Mark. Mr. Velosh, I just want to say that, Mark, you made an excellent point. If anybody has seen the election calendar, it is immense. So, and I would encourage you to look at that, because interspersed between all of those many deadlines are internal deadlines, dozens of things about confirming polling locations, poll worker recruitment and training, testing of voting systems, those logic and accuracy tests, signature verification, petitions, independent candidate filings, processing minor party candidate lists, candidate withdrawals, voter challenges. So just to make a point to the committee that what our Secretary of State's office does and our county election officials, you move mountains to make this process work. And the coordination required is incredible. So I just want to, just a little point of personal comment, just thank you all for your wonderful efforts, because it is a lot, and it's probably not fully acknowledged. So I would personally like to acknowledge and thank you for your great efforts. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. I'll certainly carry your message back to the team and convey it to the county and city election officials as well. I'm proud that we work as tightly as we do, and truly, right, no greater cause than ensuring that this constitutional right is conducted the way it is.
Thank you, Vice
Hi,
Chair.
Mark. This is Amy Tarkanian for the record. I have a question regarding now that the Republican Party is holding a caucus versus the state mandated PPP. What is to stop somebody from participating in both? Are there any type of measures since the PPP is going to be done electronically and with mail-in ballots versus the caucus doing a hand count? Is there any way to compare those, and is there any type of repercussions, or what happens?
Excellent question, Ms. Tarkanian, and Mark Voloshin, for the record, I appreciate the opportunity to clarify. There's two opportunities here, and I just want to make sure that I'm clear. For candidates, the Office of the Secretary of State, of course, we're following statutes, and there's no statutory prohibition on an individual filing for office with the Secretary of State for the President's Preference Primary and partaking in a caucus as a candidate. There may be private organizational restrictions otherwise, but that is out of my purview to speak to. On the voter side, again, very similarly, it's my understanding, again, speaking specifically to the abilities of a Nevadan to cast a ballot when eligible, there's no prohibition on a voter casting a ballot for the PPP, and then also partaking in the caucus process, either, at least from the statutory and regulatory standpoint from the state and from the Secretary of State. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Is there anyone else who has any questions for Mark?
Hi, Tammy Tiger for the record. I just have one quick question, Mr. Vlashin. I believe Mr. DiChiara came to the Nevada Indian Commission and talked to us about the ability to use the system for Native American voters with tribal IDs. Will that system be available for the 2024 primary, or when do we expect that to be in place?
Thank you for the question, Ms. Tiger. Yes, Mark Voloshin for the record. The EASE system that is now following passage of a bill whose name evades me, unfortunately, during this last legislative session, does authorize and cover tribal voters who live on a colony or reservation for its use, and that program EASE will be turned on and available not later than 45 days prior to the presidential preference primary, to the June primary, and the November general. Those dates specifically, I have them. I'm just reading them off of the nvsos.gov 2024 election information page. Prior to the presidential preference primary, it will be turned on not later than December 23rd. Prior to the June primary, it will be turned on not later than April 27th. Prior to the general election in November, it will be turned on not later than September 21st. And to be clear, because that EASE system is its use is expanded beyond military and overseas voters under Nevada law. If there are special elections that occur between now, really going forward, the ease system will be turned on to ensure that voters with a disability and tribal voters who live on a colony or reservation are able to use it and cast a ballot as appropriate.
Thank you. Thank you so much for making that happen.
Are there any other questions? If not, let's move ahead. And I want to thank Mark very much for taking the time to be here on a very busy day. And thank you so much for your efforts every day and your team. Thank you. All right, moving ahead. We're now have a moment here for our committee to make comments or offer any other thoughts that they have at this point. We've heard a lot of information today, learned a lot. My head is swimming with dates. So please, who would like to go first?
Chair, this is Maggie Salas Crespo for the record. I do have a quick update for the committee, and then I'll move forward. So during the April committee, I believe the committee voted to allow our office to take lead and begin establishing the youth focus panel. So just very quickly for this committee, our office has been working with Jen Vogt, who did a presentation during our last meeting, and we have a tentative timeline. Recruitment for members of that board will begin next month. So our office will be sending you that information. So we do ask the committee members to please share that with your networks, because we do want to have as many students represented. And we will also be providing you some of those key dates to pay attention to, as well as just the overarching plan, in hopes that by the next meeting we can talk a little bit more thoroughly. But the idea is to form the committee during fall before students go on break and for the holidays, and have the panel convene at the beginning of the year and work through the year to ensure that the proper attention is given to turning out our young voters.
Thank you, Maggie, for that update. And yes, that
Pauline
will.
Lee, for the record, a quick question, and that is, when you talk about use, what is the age range you are hoping to get on the committee?
So we don't have a specific full through age range, but we can definitely set an age range if the committee believes that would be helpful. But we are wanting to recruit students from high school. So we'll definitely be getting students who are seniors, 18 or about to turn 18, and that are well into their 20s and early 30s. But we can set up a range and send it your way. And again, for the committee, if you all, since we've talked a lot about outreach today, this is your time to give us some feedback to the Secretary of State's office, and what are some possible ways or efforts we can deploy to ensure we turn out our voters.
This is Tammy Tiger for the record. So I have a couple of updates I wanted to share. The Nevada Indian Commission, we voted at our last meeting to establish a statewide civic engagement task force that's comprised of Nevada tribal leaders along with urban Native leaders to help oversee all aspects of civic engagement. We are including UNLV and UNR with our partnership on Native Youth Camp Civics, and a presentation with civics and our partnership with the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians Tribal Education Initiative. And I did want to give some input on outreach. I love that you've added us to the news releases, but if you had like some short social media graphics that we could reshare that we know is like good information, we don't have, it's written correctly, and I'd love to see the secretary do a TikTok with all his high school outreach activities, but something like that, since we are really working on targeting youth, and something that allows us to like quickly reshare it on social media and not have to go into Canva and retype everything. But I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Bishop Derek Crimson, excuse me, Bishop Derek Crimson for the record. First, I do want to thank our Secretary Aguilar for providing and bringing and having Maggie come to the Historical West Side to give us the litany of dates that we have here. Again, I think hopefully we can somehow put this on paper so that we can be able to disseminate this information for the dates. I think that's going to be vitally important for our community, as well as possibly, because of course we have groups and various groups that are putting together strategies to make sure that we get voters to the polls, so forth and so on. But if somehow we can maybe put together some type of form or somebody that can come in, represent, to just kind of give a little bit more education on the voter status and how we can make sure that, you know, we are able to, we don't have any glitches and niches, I guess, with the voting process would be one of our concerns. Because of course, you know, I guess the Historical West, African American community, and we are not always going to follow these public forums is really the way we work. We more or less will, if you give us information, disseminated, printed information, then we have something in hand we can pass out, you know, that kind of thing. But we need to make sure that we have all of this vital information so that our voters are educated on many of the changes and laws and things that are taking place. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop. That's a very good point. And Maggie, I believe that through the Public Information Office, as the voter education initiatives roll out, we, as the committee members, will be the first to receive word regarding that. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
Okay.
The program information officer who's here, Cecilia Heston,
I didn't
is
see her.
working very diligently with Mark Relashin, our deputy for elections, on putting together a robust voter engagement and outreach plan. So again, all of these ideas are good for us because we'll definitely incorporate that into us. But yeah, we'll make sure that this committee is made aware and we get you all of that information and resources. Thank you.
I think the idea of that the bishop made of his suggestion of having dates kind of compiled in a concise manner for us as our little grab to go to when we field questions within our networks would be extremely helpful. Bishop Mark had to leave, but we will make sure that he receives word about your suggestion. Thank you. Okay. If we may, I'd like to quickly, we're a little bit over our deadline. This is now going to the next part of our agenda, which is the second public comment period. And once again, I want to make sure that we have information, everyone understands how to reach out to us. We have people here in Carson. There may be people down in Las Vegas, I'm sure. And the number for those who are tuning in via Zoom is, well, the number is 888-475-4499. The meeting ID number is 847-9043-2305, followed by the pound sign. So if we can, begin with any in-person comments here in Carson City. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Scott Hohen. I am the elected clerk recorder here in Carson City. I'm responsible for elections. And I first want to say thank you to our Secretary, Cisco Aguilar, for taking the time to come to our Carson City Vote Election Center and meet with our staff and team and hear about any issues or concerns that we may have. So thank you for doing that. Thank you to Mr. Walashan for his exhaustive list of 2024 tasks that we're going to be challenged with. I do appreciate that. But on top of what his list was, he neglected to say that we're in the process of implementing Secretary Aguilar's voter registration system by March 1st, which is a big challenge in itself to run. So a lot of work to be done in 2024. But I did want to say to Mr. Lee's closed primary comment toward the beginning of the meeting, that was the $64,000 question. That's the most important takeaway that I get out of this. What Carson City is going to do is we're going to plan to educate 100% of our voting community, our active voters, and try our best to explain that the nonpartisan will not have a ballot delivered to them come the February election. So we're going to educate 100% of the people with a sample ballot, but only those active registered voters in the party, per Mr. Walashan's presentation, will receive a ballot. So I want to communicate to at least the Carson City residents, 1/3 of our population is nonpartisan. 1/3 is not going to receive a ballot, which is about 13,500 people. If you want to voice and if you want to vote, please change your party now. Go online to the Nevada Secretary of State website, change your party to the Democrat side, the Republican side, then you'll get a ballot, then you can have your voice made. You can always change it back to nonpartisan if you want to, but change it early. The reason why I say that is we, as clerk recorders, we have to prepare for those people showing up at the polls during that early election period or the election day to re-register themselves, and we have to take that as same-day registration. It's more work, it's more effort. It requires the voter to bring in ID. So if we can offload that and get a lot of that done on the front end, that will help us as clerk recorders throughout the state. And I can't stress that enough to the public. Register, change early, check your registration if you want to vote in the February election. So with that, thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else here in Carson City? All right. Let's go down to Las Vegas. Do we have any in-person commenters who would like to speak? Appears as though we do not. All right. I'd like to ask Broadcasting Services, do we have any members of the public virtually who would like to provide a statement to the committee?
Thank you. If you would like to provide public comment for today's meeting, please press *9 now or raise hand in the Zoom client to take your place in the queue.
It appears as though we do not have, excuse me.
Oh, there are no callers wishing to make public comment at this time.
Thank you so much. All right. Well, again, thank you, everyone, for coming today. Thank you, Secretary Aguilar, for being here. This was a very informative meeting. We were happy to and feel honored that we had everyone here from the committee to attend and listen and to take messages back to their network about all the good work that your office does and will be doing in for the next 15 months. Thank you so much, especially to your staff members, Maggie and Mark and Maria and Cecilia, for all the work they do every day in support of this committee. It's much appreciated. With that, I'd like to entertain a motion to adjourn.
Pauline Lee for the record. So moved.
We have a motion from Pauline Lee to adjourn. Any second?
Maggie Salas Crespo, second the motion.
We have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Say aye.
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 All of us. Thank you very much. Have a good day. We are adjourned.